the traditional teaching is that saturated fat is horrible for you. So where does that come from?
So let me just give a brief history of where this idea came from. Maybe, your viewers already know this, but we can just briefly review. It comes from a scientist named Ancel Keys, who was a professor at the University of Minnesota, and was he came up with this idea that saturated fat and dietary cholesterol, so the kind of cholesterol you find in egg yolks, shellfish, that those two nutrients in foods they would cause your blood cholesterol to go up, and then that would clog your arteries and ultimately give you a heart attack. That was called the diet heart hypothesis. And Ancel Keys proposed that in the 1950s. And he stepped into a situation of kind of a vacuum of information at that time, right? Heart disease, which had been almost non-existent in the early 1900s, had risen by the mid-century to be the #1 killer in America. And notably, in 1955, President Eisenhower has a heart attack in the Oval Office. And he's then, he's taken away from, he has to go on bed rest for 10 whole days. The whole nation is transfixed and focused on this question, like, what is causing heart disease? Because at the time there was no accepted cause that had been established, and there were a number of competing hypotheses. There was this idea that it might be the rising amount of auto exhaust that had come about from more cars on the roads. It could have, people thought it was the result of vitamin deficiency. People thought that it was the type A personality, somebody going around and screaming at everybody and then having a heart attack and dying. Those were all viable theories, but it was Ancel Keys, through basically his networking and his personal charisma and his ability to, as even his friends say, argue anybody to the death, that he was able to promote his idea into, importantly, with leading doctors of the time, including Eisenhower's doctor. But probably the most significant event was when he got onto the nutrition committee of the American Heart Association. So the American Heart Association was the most authoritative group then, and probably one would say now, telling people what to do about heart disease. Ancel Keys was able to swing that group around in the course of a year, based really on no data, but he was able to convince this group to endorse the diet heart hypothesis and tell everybody, well, at that time it was just men, tell men, 1961, avoid eating saturated fat, replace saturated fat in meat and eggs with polyunsaturated vegetable oils in order to avoid a heart attack. That is like the little kernel of advice that grew into this huge oak tree of recommendations that we now have all over the world. And because that has been our advice for now 60 years, it's extremely hard to disentangle, because it's really a kind of a very firm established dogma. But just to continue that through line, what happened after 1961? Well, many governments around the world, including yours in Australia, they realized that although this recommendation had gone out, there really was no rigorous evidence for it, which is to say clinical trials, randomized controlled clinical trials, that is the only kind of evidence that can show cause and effect. So these governments undertook really some of the most ambitious, largest, longest clinical trials that have ever been done in nutrition in the 1960s and 70s. And these studies, they were interpreted to imply that saturated fats did in fact cause heart disease. And so that was sort of what was accepted for decades. But due to my work, the work of journalist Gary Taubes, we went back and analyzed those trials and looked at them. One of them had never been properly randomized, another one had not controlled for smoking, another one had let people wander in and out of their study and not really kept track of them. There were studies that had been ignored where they showed they had to end the study early because people were dying. People on the vegetable oil diet were dying. So it turned out that these trials did not say what they were supposed to. So that's what came out in my book and in Gary Taub's book, Good Calories, Bad Calories. And that was in the early, so, that happened in like the 2000s, right? And so now the last decade has really seen an kind of a real sea change in the science of saturated fat, because scientists have been alerted to these clinical trials and they realize that they have been ignored, lost. Somehow we never paid attention to these studies in a rigorous way. So now there are at least 20 papers that have done systematic reviews, or meta-analyses they're called, but really rigorous reviews of these clinical trials. And what have they concluded? They have concluded that the data do not support the diet heart hypothesis, which is to say, the idea that saturated fat and dietary cholesterol cause heart disease is not supported by the evidence. Even though that idea has been tested, it's one of the most tested hypotheses in the history of nutrition science, but the results do not support that hypothesis. So, when you really test a hypothesis at that level and you get what's called null results, you have to just move on and say, okay, we have to look at some other ideas. But just to emphasize how important this literature is from the last decade, these 20 review papers include a paper that I was somewhat involved in, which is by a group of authors that include 4 former members of the expert committees who actually wrote our US dietary guidelines. So these are people who are saying, we wrote the guideline, but now we think that's wrong. We didn't know about this evidence. We've reconsidered it. And that paper was published by the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, which is a very prestigious, it's called a high impact journal, read by cardiologists. It was branded as a state-of-the-art review by the journal. It was selected by the editor-in-chief of that journal as one of the most important papers of the year that it came out. I'm thinking it's maybe 2019 now. But so that's an extremely important paper. So I think that, what we have found is that the scientific community, different groups of scientists from around the world, these 20 papers have really concluded that we got it wrong on saturated fats. And the challenge now is to get that science to rise up and be considered by our government agencies in charge of these guidelines. And there's just a lot of resistance to that, or stubbornness, or difficulty kind of dealing with this change in our understanding on saturated fats and this new data. So we can talk about it. That gets into the realm of politics, but in the scientific world, there's really been a pretty firm understanding that saturated fats, we made a mistake on saturated fats. Yeah. Former editor-in-chief of the British Medical Journal, which is the oldest and most prestigious journals in the world, Fiona Godley, said at a conference, I think we really have to, we owe an apology to people. We made a mistake on saturated fats.